In the world of architecture, foundations matter, and not just in buildings but in relationships, respect, and trust. For years, I was the foundation of every major project my boss Alan ever touched. I poured myself into the details, solved impossible problems, and made his grand visions a reality. And he took the credit. I accepted that dynamic, not because I was naive, but because I believed in the work. I believed in beauty, in design, in building something that would outlast us. But every foundation has a limit. And Alan? He didn't just overstep it, he tried to build his legacy on a structure he never understood. What he didn't realize was that I was the only one who knew exactly where every load-bearing wall was, and how to bring the entire thing crashing down. My name is Jessica Hayes, and for 7 years, I served as the lead project manager at Sterling and Croft, a renowned architecture firm with a sterling reputation. I wasn't one of the glamorous partners with TED Talks and design awards. I was the bridge, the person who translated grand visions into reality. I turned artistic daydreams into blueprints, made budgets sing and timelines dance. The complex, the impossible, the cutting edge, I brought it all to life, quietly and without applause. Alan Croft, one of the firm's senior partners, was the face of our success. Once a brilliant architect, he had long since traded the drafting board for the boardroom. He wore perfectly tailored suits, gave grand speeches, and dazzled clients with charisma. But the dirty truth behind every one of his visionary presentations? That was me. I crunched the numbers. I built the slides. I made sure his pitches were technically sound. I made the impossible seem inevitable. He walked into every meeting like a king while I stayed in the shadows, adjusting the lights. I put up with it. His ego, his entitlement, his complete lack of understanding of the tools and software we actually used to build his dreams. Because the work mattered to me, the designs mattered. And if I had to be invisible to keep those projects alive, so be it. Then came the project that changed everything. It was called the Monocultural Center, a landmark initiative funded by two Spanish brothers, Ricardo and Javier Morno, art patrons, legacy builders. They wanted to give Madrid a crown jewel, a state-of-the-art cultural sanctuary that would blend modernity with Spanish tradition. It was a project architects dreamed of. $500 million. The eyes of the world watching. Every major firm was competing. Alan wanted it like he had never wanted anything before. You could feel it in the air, his hunger, his desperation. I took charge. I led a team of 20 of the firm's best. For a year, we lived and breathed the Morno project. Weekends bled into weekdays, holidays blurred. I obsessed over every inch, from the structural angles of the roof to the choice of Andalusian marble in the lobby. The result? A masterpiece. A building of flowing lines and intelligent design. Solar harmonics, acoustic physics, Spanish heritage etched into every beam. It was the best work of my life. It was art. And when the time came to present our vision to the Morno brothers, Alan was giddy. He had been preparing in his own strange way, walking around the office for weeks practicing clunky business Spanish he had learned from a phrasebook. Buenos Camud, he'd say to startled interns, convinced his effort would win over the Spanish clients. It was awkward, cringe-inducing, but Alan didn't care. He thought he was being strategic. He never once asked me about my background. Never once wondered why I flinched at his pronunciation. He had no idea that Spanish was my first language, the language of my childhood, the voice of my grandmother, who raised me in a house filled with the rhythms and stories of Andalusia. Spanish wasn't a tactic for me, it was memory. It was home. It was sacred. But to Alan, I was just Jessica, the quiet manager who made the machine hum. He didn't know I understood every single word he mangled. The day of the presentation arrived. The Mornos were exactly as I had imagined: sharp, elegant, dignified, men of deep culture and greater pride. They walked into our boardroom dressed in understated luxury, greeted Alan's enthusiastic "Bay Inviterma" with patient smiles, and settled into their seats. I stood off to the side, behind the tech podium, ready to run the slides and the 3D virtual walkthrough. Silent, professional, invisible, Alan began his pitch. I'll give him this: he could speak. He painted pictures with his words, weaving drama and purpose into every architectural sketch I had spent months perfecting. He talked of legacy, of light, of community, and the Morno brothers listened, attentive and curious. We had them until the screen froze, a small glitch. The rendering paused, just for a second or two, as I transitioned from one phase of the walkthrough to the next. It wasn't catastrophic, but in that high-stakes silence, every second felt like a minute. Alan's rhythm faltered. He turned toward me, his face twitching with panic. He needed to do something, say something, but he also wanted to maintain the illusion of control in front of his prestigious guests. So he leaned toward me and whispered a sentence he would never recover from. Por favor, el no cuajando, he said, in butchered Spanish. A pause, a breath. It hit me like a slap. What he meant to say was, please help her, she doesn't know what she's doing. But what he actually said clumsily, arrogantly translated to something much worse. The useless one doesn't know what she's doing. He called me useless. In Spanish, in my language, right to my face, in front of the clients. A petty, condescending aside disguised as cleverness. He thought I wouldn't understand. He thought they wouldn't either. But they did. The Mornos heard it. I saw it in their eyes, something sharp, something cold, a flicker of shared disgust. They said nothing, just waited. And in that breathless moment, everything changed. My body remained still, my hands steady on the podium. But inside me, a storm was building. He had called me useless. He had desecrated something sacred, not just with the insult, but with the careless use of my first language, the voice of my grandmother, the language of bedtime stories, warm kitchens, and the kind of love that never needed translation. Alan used it like a parlor trick, a party favor to impress the powerful. He didn't realize the weight of what he'd said. He never realized the weight of anything he just performed. And that day, he performed in front of the wrong audience. Still, I didn't flinch. I fixed the glitch with a few quiet keystrokes. The 3D walkthrough resumed. The Mornos never said a word, but they saw everything. I could feel it, the shift. In the room, subtle but seismic, Alan kept going, unaware he was standing on a fault line. He basked in what he believed was his moment of glory, spouting empty words over my work, my vision, my soul. But the audience wasn't listening to him anymore. I watched as Ricardo and Javier's eyes returned to me again and again, their polite expressions tight, their interest clearly elsewhere. It wasn't just that they had caught Alan's insult. It was the realization of where the genius truly came from. The air was different now. The silence between their questions was heavier, more deliberate. When Alan finished his performance, smug and satisfied, he flashed his signature grin and turned to the room. And now, gentlemen, he said grandly, I'd be happy to answer any further questions about the design. Of course, my project manager, Jessica, is here to assist with the finer technical details. He gestured toward me like I was a machine. He had plugged in for convenience. He had no idea. He had just handed me the microphone figuratively and literally. Ricardo Morno looked straight at me, calm and assured. Yes, he said, we do have a few questions. For Miss Hayes. He didn't look at Alan again. He waited for me to say my name, something Alan had never bothered to learn after all these years. I met his gaze with quiet confidence. Jessica Hayes, I said evenly. Ricardo gave a small nod. Then he did something Alan never expected. He switched to Spanish, but not the hollow, stilted Spanish Alan had practiced in mirrors. This was true Spanish, fluid, rich, the kind of language that lives in libraries and music and whispered memories. Señorita Hayes, Ricardo began, mi hermano y yo estamos profundamente impresionados con la complejidad y belleza de este. Es claro que fue criado con un entendimiento íntimo de nuestra cultura. Nos gustará de usted directamente. Si el fue su filosofía en decir esta obra. Translation, Miss Hayes, my brother and I are deeply impressed by the beauty and complexity of this design. It is clear that it was created by someone with a profound understanding of our culture. We'd like to hear from you directly. What philosophy guided your hand in creating this? A stillness fell across the boardroom. Alan blinked, confused. He couldn't follow the conversation, couldn't hear the language, couldn't recognize that he was no longer the star of the show. He opened his mouth slightly, unsure whether to interrupt, translate, or retreat. I looked at Ricardo. I looked at Javier. And I smiled. Then I answered, in Spanish. Not Alan's textbook Spanish, not Google Translate Spanish, but the Spanish of my soul, the voice of my grandmother. Andalusian tones, soft vowels, and the warmth of heritage that cannot be faked. Sears Morno, I began, gracias. Est proyecto no fu simplemente una teoría profesional para fu una carta de amor, una carta a mi abuela, que me enseñó Madrid no solo como una ciudad, sino como un latido. Thank you, I said. This project wasn't just professional for me. It was a love letter. A letter to my grandmother, who taught me to see Madrid not just as a city but as a heartbeat. I spoke for 5 uninterrupted minutes. I told them how the angles of the skylights echoed the lighting in classic Velázquez paintings, how the courtyard's curves were inspired by the winding alleys of Lavapiés, how the acoustic geometry of the performance hall was a tribute to the soundboards of handcrafted Spanish guitars. It wasn't a pitch. It was a story in which every element, glass, stone, sound, and silence was part of a culture I carried in my blood. I spoke with the confidence of someone who no longer had anything to prove, because I didn't. My work was already in front of them. My heritage was flowing through every line of the building, and my voice, my real voice, was finally being heard. Alan, he was silent, standing like an ornament in the corner, clueless and powerless, stripped of the one thing he had always depended on, control. He couldn't interrupt. He couldn't perform. He couldn't even understand what we were saying. He just watched as the spotlight he had tried so hard to keep was pulled away naturally, deservedly, and focused on the one person in the room he had always underestimated. Me. As I finished speaking, the room remained still. A weighted silence, rich with unspoken truths, stretched across the boardroom like a drawn curtain. Just before the final act, Alan stood stiffly beside the table, hands awkwardly clasped, eyes scanning the faces around him for reassurance that never came. He was waiting for applause, but none arrived. The moment no longer belonged to him. Ricardo Morno smiled not with polite courtesy, but with genuine warmth and addressed the partners directly. Mr. Croft, he began in sharp, measured English, this firm has presented us with a design of extraordinary soul and vision, but it is clear to us now that the soul belongs not to you, but to Miss Hayes. Alan's expression twisted slightly, as if the words didn't register at first, as if he were watching a scene in a language he couldn't translate. Ricardo continued, letting the silence punctuate each word. A project of this scale and cultural importance must be built on respect, transparency, and integrity. After what we've just witnessed, we are not confident that you are the right person to lead it. He turned to me. However, he said, his voice warm again, our offer to partner with Sterling and Croft still stands, but only under one condition, that Miss Jessica Hayes be appointed the lead architectural director of the Morno Cultural Center with full creative autonomy and a direct line of communication to us. She will lead. You will not. The effect was immediate. A hush swept the boardroom. You could hear the air shift in everyone's lungs. Alan looked stunned, his smile completely gone, his face paling under the fluorescent lights. The other partners stared ahead, no one moving, no one daring to speak. Alan opened his mouth to object, to reclaim control, to spin the narrative back in his favor, but no words came. For once, the master of the pitch had nothing to say. This was not a negotiation. It was a verdict. The Morno brothers stood, adjusted their cuffs, and offered me a nod of respect. And in that subtle gesture, the hierarchy of the entire firm inverted itself. Alan, who had stood at the top for so long, was now just a silhouette in the corner of a room where he no longer mattered. And I, the woman he had called useless in the language of my grandmother, had just been handed the project that would define the firm's legacy. The partners had no choice. They agreed to the terms. Alan was immediately removed from the project, not fired, but strategically sidelined. He kept his title for formality's sake, but all power, all influence, all relevance had been stripped away. The corner office, once his kingdom, was vacated by week's end. I was given the keys, a new title, a massive raise, and most importantly, the trust of the very clients who mattered most. My first official meeting as lead architectural director was held 2 days later, this time in my own office. Ricardo and Javier arrived with quiet dignity, their presence as commanding as ever, but now they addressed me with ease, with friendship, with mutual respect. As we sat down to discuss the next phase of design implementation, Ricardo leaned back slightly, smiling with a knowing glint in his eye. La until, he said softly, the useless one repeating Alan's insult. But this time, there was no sting. There was only irony. I smiled in return. Avises, I replied gently. Las personas ms tiles son las que nadie sabe ver. Sometimes I said, the most useful people are the ones others fail to see, and with that, we began. No longer under someone else's shadow, no longer silent, no longer overlooked. The Morno Cultural Center would be built not just from stone and steel, but from memory, soul, and the language of respect. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind, not of chaos, but of clarity. For the first time in my professional life, I was leading not from behind the curtain, but from center stage. My team, those who had always known the truth, rallied behind me with quiet pride. The office shifted subtly. People stood straighter, meetings felt more purposeful, and respect flowed not from fear or hierarchy, but from recognition. Alan's presence, once so dominant, faded like a monument whose foundation had crumbled. He still roamed the halls, still wore the suits, still tried to insert himself into conversations with his old bravado, but it was hollow now. Everyone knew he had been publicly unmasked, and there was no curtain to hide behind anymore. The Morno Cultural Center became more than a project. It became a statement. Every design decision, every conversation, every blueprint carried the weight of reclamation. I poured myself into the work not to prove anything, but to honor the responsibility I had been given. I was no longer chasing validation. I had earned it, and I wore it like armor. One afternoon, as I walked through the now vacated model room where it had all begun, I found myself standing before the scale replica of the cultural center. I studied the flowing lines, the delicate arch of the atrium, the interplay of shadow and glass. I remembered staying up all night refining that design, hands cramped from drawing, heart aching from doubt. I ran my fingers along the edge of the model's facade, and a quiet smile touched my lips. This was mine, not because I had claimed it, but because I had created it. Later that month, the Morno brothers hosted a formal reception to announce the groundbreaking ceremony in Madrid. It was a grand affair, filled with dignitaries, journalists, and celebrated architects from around the world. I was invited, not as a supporting player, but as the honored guest. As I stepped onto the stage to deliver a short speech, I glanced at the audience. Alan was not among them. Of course not. He hadn't been invited. But I saw faces I had worked with for years, engineers, draftsmen, interns who had seen my quiet climb. They were smiling, some with tears in their eyes. I spoke not of revenge, nor retribution, but of legacy. I spoke of buildings as vessels of memory, of architecture as the art of listening not just to clients, but to culture, to history, to soul. I ended with a quiet nod to my roots. In every stone of this structure, I said softly, there will be the echo of stories told to me in the language of my childhood. And that language, once used to silence me, is now the voice of something beautiful, lasting, and true. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what moved me most was the silence just before it, the reverent, breath-held moment of understanding. It was the kind of silence that only comes after truth is spoken plainly and heard deeply. In the end, Alan didn't fall because I pushed him. He fell because he built his empire on a false assumption that being loud was the same as being powerful, that being seen was the same as being respected, and that those who work in silence are somehow lesser. He forgot that foundations like people hold more power than anyone realizes. Until they're gone. And I didn't just survive. I flourished. I led a project that made headlines around the world. I became a name that meant something in my industry. I mentored young women who reminded me of myself, bright, driven, unseen. And I told them, use your voice when you're ready. And never forget, the language of respect is spoken in actions, not words, because sometimes the final word doesn't need to be loud to change everything. Sometimes it just needs to be true.